Hello, this is Fiona Cuthbertson coming for the pod, and today we're going to do our So You Want To series. And this week we're lucky enough to have Tom Harris, who's going to do So You Want to Be a Columnist. He is a podcasting legend himself, having hosted the first podcast recorded in the Commons called Two Men in a Pod. He also ran The Imposter. He was founding member of the podcast The Power of Three, and he regularly writes for The Telegraph and other outlets. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Fiona. Lovely to see you again.
Thank you very much. So, tell us a bit about what it's like to be a columnist and what moment you decided you wanted to go into that job.
Well, it's not as simple as that. I was a journalist from the age of 20 and worked in local newspapers before I went to work for the Labour Party, which is my first job in public relations. I'll be honest, I wasn't a great news reporter. My news editors at the time will testify to this. I had my moments, but the writing I was most comfortable with was kind of longer features article rather than news items. So I went into public relations for the Labour Party and then for local government before becoming in 2001. That's a great platform to continue writing opinion pieces. And I was really delighted that one of the perks of being an MP was you'd be asked to write about your own opinion. I mean, being an MP for me in the first place was being paid to bang on about my opinion, which was lovely. And when I was being asked actually to write for newspapers or magazines about a particular subject, it was a dream come true. So I lost my seat in 2015 and went into public affairs or lobbying, so not public relations. Um, and I managed to eke out a living over the next year. And then I was approached. I was doing regular columns online mostly for the Telegraph because this coincided, of course, with Jeremy Corbyn becoming leader of the Labour Party. And my animosity and objection to Jeremy was, utterly ruthless. And I spent a lot of time just staring open mouthed at the Labour Party. I remember I put a tweet out on the day that Jeremy was elected as leader on the 12th of September 2015. And I said, can someone please turn the Labour Party off and back on again? I just couldn't believe. I mean, I still can. I look back, Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party, it's just so bizarre. Anyway, the Telegraph liked this approach, as you would expect. So started asking me to write a few articles, mostly online, the situation in the Labour Party. And then about 6 months later, I got a phone call to say, look, Dan Hodges, who was our daily columnist, is moving off to Mail on Sunday. How would you like his job? And it was a godsend for me because it didn't pay that much at the time, but it gave me an extra income. And when you've just come out of Parliament after 14 years and you've got a very young family and a very large mortgage, you think all the time about, how can you provide for the family? And this was the first time that I'd been offered regular, dependable work. So I don't want to sound mercenary about it, but that was obviously a big part of my agenda. But the joy of it, well, was first of all work of the Telegraph, because the guys on the Telegraph comment desk were just brilliant. I mean, I would go to them in the morning and how would you fancy an article about this? This is annoying me. I'd go through Twitter early in the morning, see what was annoying me. And then I'd come up with a subject and phone up the desk and say, this is annoying me. How do you feel about this? And they'd almost always say, yeah, it sounds great. Sometimes they'd phone me and make a suggestion. The one thing I would point out, because it's a Telegraph, so it's known as a Conservative supporting newspaper, I have never once, I've now worked for them for 10 years. I have never once been asked to write something I don't believe. I've never been asked to write something that, is against Labour Party policy, for example, if I didn't actually believe in the narrative thrust of that article. So they've been great on that respect. I mean, just before the general election, explaining why I was voting Labour. And for the Telegraph, I think that's pretty open-minded. I think I did a calculation once. I've written a lot more than 1 million words since they employed me. So
Wow, that's a lot of words. And obviously in today's environment, it's 24-hour news. How do you get started as a columnist now?
I'm not going to pretend that my path to becoming a columnist was typical, because it's only typical if you're a former member of parliament. And I think there's probably quite a few of my former colleagues who would quite like this particular gig as well. I don't think many of them can actually do it, I hasten to add, because, writing a daily column is quite a tricky thing. But if you're just a journalist starting out and you want to be a columnist, I mean, you've got to find your own voice, but you've got to find a reason why a comment desk will actually employ you. If you're just, if you're a junior reporter in the Milton Keynes Gazette or whatever, and you've got strong opinions about politics, chances are you're not going to be employed by any national newspaper to voice those opinions because, why would they? I was given the post because I was a politician at a national level and I was a minister in a government department. And obviously, one of the reasons the Telegraph chose me is because I was a critic at the time of the Labour Party. And those are particularly interesting selling points if you're trying to market a column. Just having an opinion isn't enough. You need to have a reason for a comment editor to say, yeah, we want this particular opinion, but we want it from this particular individual. That is much harder.
Is that what makes a great column then? Making sure that you have an opinion that matters and that you can sell it properly and show your standing in that area and that understanding of what's going on.
I think, yes, that is a huge part of it. I mean, for me, I developed the talent really early on, and this was the great thing about having a kind of traditional training as a journalist, because you're taught very early on, back in olden days when we used typewriters. Listeners can ask their parents what that is. And, we learned very early on how to summarize an entire complicated story in the first paragraph. And that sounds reasonably straightforward. It's not. It's one of the most difficult things I ever had to master. And I took that lesson with me into being a columnist because the most important thing you can do is to take, most issues in politics are not straightforward. They are relatively complicated. And I'm not talking about economics or geopolitics. I'm just talking about almost everyday, situation that comes up in politics. For example, why would you get rid of a prime minister after only 2 years? That's a complicated thing to analyze. But I think if you want to be a columnist, you've got to take issues like that, translate it from gobbledygook using plain English that people will understand, using metaphors and analogies that people understand, and making that entertaining and sometimes funny so that the ordinary people don't feel patronized, but they do understand, the argument you're trying to make. I don't want to overstate it. I don't want to make this sound as if it is rocket science and only very, very intelligent, incredibly talented people can write a newspaper column. Open up almost any newspaper and that will be proved wrong right away. But I do think there are abilities and skills that you do need, and to analyze complicated issues and explain it without sounding patronizing to people is a big part of it.
And you mentioned the fact that it is the first few lines or the first paragraph that really grab the reader. So what is your favorite technique for making sure that they stay with you and that they read the full column?
It varies. It varies from subject to subject. It also varies from newspaper to newspaper. I write quite a lot, or occasionally for the Daily Mail and the Scottish Daily Mail. And I find that when you're writing for them, I tend to be slightly less humorous. I'll get straight to the point and summarize the issue in the opening part. Whereas in the Telegraph, they will sometimes let me go off on one, onto some kind of weird meandering metaphor. And I just have to hope that people are going to follow me long enough to get to the punchline, which I have to say is often quite funny. I use my wife as a sounding board on this. I think you must have met my wife various times. You
Yeah,
were always walking along
yeah.
a committee corridor, and she worked for me for a little while down in the Commons. But if I'm unsure about a particular joke, whether it's going to land or not, I will tell it to Carolyn. And if she laughs, I'll use it. And if she doesn't, I tend not to. So humor is a big part of it. I do enjoy making people laugh. I sometimes enjoy making myself laugh and think, I don't care if anyone else finds this funny. I know objectively this is a funny thing to say. If no one else laughs, hell mend them. But most time people will laugh. And what's entertaining is sometimes the Telegraph will ask me to go below the line And this is a very dangerous thing to do. They'll ask me to go into the comments underneath my column where Telegraph subscribers have left comments and asked questions about my column. And they asked me to go there as the author to respond to some of them. And that can be quite a sobering experience. And sometimes those people don't take that well to my sense of humor. But anyway, I don't care because they don't know where I live.
And it's also therefore important to have a sounding board so that you can make sure that the structure of your column could potentially hit the spot and that you're not going completely wrong.
Yes, I mean, most of my columns follow a very straightforward structure. You got the intro, which may be a metaphor of. I love to dwell. I love to go back in political history, usually to a period that I remember, but sometimes beyond that. The Critchell Down scandal. And I love to kind of tell people about some weird aspects of British political history, but it's often things that I remember when I was very young, like Thatcher's downfall or something like that. And you'll draw an analogy with a historical event, and then at the end of it, you've got to try to draw all those kind of straws together to remind people what the original point of the article was and just to remind them why it was relevant. And you can do that most of the time because I think there's very little new in politics. Almost everything has been done before. So usually there is something to be learned from British political history. And I love doing that. I just love looking back at the last 30, 40, 50 years, seeing something that is reminiscent of what's happening today and maybe trying to draw lessons from that.
So do your research, make sure that you look back and see what the commonalities are so that you can draw more out of what's going on and what you're talking about at the moment.
Do your research, but also make sure you have a very good editor. I wrote something where I was talking about the criticism of Andy Burnham for being all about change and not giving any details of his policies. And I referred to George Bush the first's, George H.W. Bush, criticism of Bill Clinton in 92. And I mentioned about Bush criticizing Clinton's hope he changes stuff. Now, that was just me misremembering. That was Sarah Palin who actually said that about Barack Obama in 2008. And I had just, I'm an old man now. I get easily confused. And it was, one of my colleagues on the Telegraph comment desk who picked up on that and managed to, he kept the quote, but we changed the context of it. So it didn't embarrass me. So I was grateful for that. You've got to rely on other people as well. Our own memories are not as reliable as we all think.
And where do you draw the line between strong opinion and outright unfair attack?
I hope I've never launched an unfair attack, although supporters of Jeremy Corbyn will disagree with me on that. But I don't think I have. I tend to, not everyone will do this, I tend to abide by House of Commons rules. So I never call anyone a liar. I will say that I don't believe somebody or I think that somebody's mistaken or they're kidding themselves, but I stick to parliamentary language if I can help it. Because I think that is Commons does lots of things wrong, but one thing it does right is it forces people to be courteous to each other, and we don't have enough courtesy in politics these days. So whatever political position somebody takes, I'm not going to call them a liar. I'm not going to start insulting them personally. But when they utter something that is so outrageously wrong, I will absolutely take them to the cleaners on it.
And as a journalist, would you rather be feared or loved?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I fear the answer to that is that I'd rather be loved. And this is why I wasn't a very good politician, because I was too keen to be liked than feared or respected. And I've got a feeling that I suffer from the same problem now. Maybe I would be nominated for more awards if I was feared rather than loved. I don't like being really nasty to anyone. I really don't. And if I ever meet Keir Starmer again, my first instinct will be to apologise for some of the things I've said about him, even though they were all true. because it's nice to be nice, as they say in Glasgow. Um, so yeah, I'm afraid I'm still far too susceptible to the allure of popularity.
And what do you think is the biggest opportunity or danger for columnists just in this 24/7 news world?
Well, I mean, I think it's far more difficult for young journalists nowadays than it ever was in my time. If I had my time over again in this era, I would not become a journalist because in the 20 teens, there was a real possibility that journalism would die completely because none of the online methods of making people pay for journalism would seem to be working. Things have settled down now, thank goodness. If you go into a local newsagent, you pick up a local newspaper, they're about 8 pages long and seven of those pages are advertising, and the cover price is like £2.50. I mean, it's not a feasible model anymore. I think that's a great shame because local newspapers provided a lot of the training for the previous generations of journalists. But if I had to give anyone advice, I would say to them, pick a subject. There are more subjects than politics. There are so many specialisms that people want to read about. And you mentioned podcasting. I think it's rare these days for any columnist, especially in areas that are slightly narrower subjects. So, for example, I produce a transport podcast. I don't take part in it, I just produce it for the makers. And it's called Calling All Stations with Christian Walmart, who's a very well known transport correspondent. Now, Christian is also a columnist. And I just think it's part and parcel of the job now that if you're a columnist, you'll probably do a podcast, either your own or you'll feature regularly on other people's podcasts, because that's how people access opinions now. Now, whether that's because they don't have time to read or because more time to listen to a podcast when they're out walking the dog or whatever, the fact is those two medium media are very closely related now. So if you want to if you don't have a job at the moment, but you have an expertise, start a podcast, first of all, because if you're good at your job, I think sooner or later publication will come along and start offering you money, if not for your own podcast, then certainly for appearances on broadcast media talking about your favorite subject.
And if you have a podcast and you want to start a column, how do you build an audience in a distinctive style in order to make sure that you actually do get cut through?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult because, especially since COVID pandemic, podcasting in this country has just taken off. And it's very easy to start up a podcast. It's very difficult to build an audience right away. You've got to be consistent. If you're going to publish a podcast, do it at the same time every single week. Keep the same format so that people know what they're getting. Nothing more off-putting than getting used to a podcast, then tuning in one week and it's different personnel. People like familiarity, people fear change. So, be consistent, make it high quality, and check what else is on the market. That's the first thing. If you've got an idea for a podcast, well, go on to Apple Podcasts and do a search, find out who else is doing a podcast like that and see how they do it. Listen to a lot of podcasts, find out the good ones and the bad ones, and listen to as many bad ones as good ones. Find out what they're doing wrong and make up your own mind about how you can improve on that. And after that, one of the best things you can do, one of the most urgent things you can do is market it properly through every social media outlet that you have access to. Do cross guest appearances on other people's podcasts, and it all adds up. But I think you've got to be prepared to do it week in and week out, even when the numbers are not looking great. It's very easy to get downcast and disillusioned because you've only got 60 people listening. But if you believe in your product, that's the key, then you'll continue it. And if you've got quality, then those numbers will start rising.
And finally, what is one exercise you'd recommend to someone who wants to improve their column craft right now?
Write, just write. Don't think about a column that you would like to write. Sit down in front of your computer and write a column and keep it to within, say, 750 words. Aim for 750 words because that's another talent that people sometimes overlook. Writing to length, getting all your arguments in on a specific word count is really important. But the only way of improving your skill is to actually do it. And it doesn't matter, no one else is going to read it. I mean, you might want to show it to some loved ones, but it's not going to be published. It gives you the freedom to write anything you like. And there's no substitute for actually doing the thing that you actually want to do, even if nobody's paying you for it.
Thank you, Tom, for talking to us about what it's like to be a columnist and some fantastic advice on how to get into the industry. We hope you as viewers have found it informative, and I hope you will like and subscribe so you can watch our next set of content in this series of So You Want To. And on that note, I'll see you next time. Hope you have a good week, one and all.